Wow, that was the first time I've heard that. Okay, recording in progress. Well, good morning. Again, good to see you on Zoom this morning. Good to have you with us. Great to see so many faces this morning with us here in sight, in person. And let me just get myself organized here a little bit. I wanted to just start and just say a special thank you to Archie for being here. He's been with us last week and was here one other time this month as well. And so it's been great to have him here supporting us in our time of worship together. So thank you to Archie. I know Archie's over at the Point Nazarene Church in San Jose, and I know they're going back to weekly gatherings starting next Sunday. So there's a lot of churches, as you can imagine, making lots of different transitions during this period of time at different stages and at different paces. And I also just wanted to say a huge shout out. She's not expecting this, but a huge thank you to Stephanie. Stephanie does so much work for us each and every week in terms of getting our slides put together and the song lyrics and video and hosting the Zoom call for all of you at home to be able to be on. And so thank you to Stephanie for all of her work, and a little shout out to my sons back there helping out on computer and sound as well. So thanks to you all. And obviously to Ed and Cindy, just in continued thankfulness for your contribution to our church in terms of leading us in prayer. So we're so thankful to all of you, and just excited to see so many of you here today. And just looking forward to those that are on Zoom that are able to join us here in person soon when you feel comfortable doing so. Great to be able to see you here on site when it works for you. And anyway, just a great time to be able to be together this morning. And I want to kick things off as we want to jump in, and we want to continue our series that we've been in that's been working through basically the fruits of the Spirit that we find in Galatians chapter 5. And you know, when we learn to walk and to live by the Spirit, what we find when we do that is that we find that we're subject to a life of adventure when we're walking with the Spirit and in step with the Spirit, because God's Spirit is really not bound by our time and our restrictions and our desires. God's Spirit, as Jesus so aptly communicates to Nicodemus, you know, you can't see where the Spirit comes from or where it's going. And that's really the truth in terms of how God operates. God is mysterious in many ways, and he operates outside of our realms of maybe what we're comfortable with sometimes or what we're used to. And so that's a tremendous encouragement in many ways. There's a lot of new vitality, a lot of life that comes with following the Spirit. But it also will frustrate us sometimes to no end, because sometimes we like routine and we like to predictability, right? And we like to know things and how things are gonna function. And so walking and living by the Spirit can be frustrating to us in many ways too, because it kind of wrecks with our desires in some ways. But we also know that walking and living by the Spirit, even more so, is so important for us because of the transformation that God's Spirit wants to do in us and through us. And we've talked about this before, but this is the great gift of God's Spirit to us, is God's presence indwelling in us for the purpose of transformation, for the purpose of doing his work to transform our bodies into the life of Jesus, that we might see more of the fruit of Jesus, more of the fruit of the Spirit developed in us and through us as his people. And so we started a couple weeks ago in this series talking about what are those fruits of the Spirit. And so up on the screen, you're going to see, again, Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 and 23. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And last week, we started this by unpacking two of these fruits. And we talked about the fruits of patience and kindness. And we spent some time looking at creation, if you remember, looking at how creation shows us the realities of God in terms of God's patience and kindness. I won't go back and preach that message again. You can watch it on YouTube if you want to, and if you missed it last week. And we also looked at the life of Jesus to see how the life of Jesus embodied a life of patience and kindness. This morning, my hope is to tackle 3 more of these fruits. We may not get to all 3 of them. That's okay. If we have to carry over next week, we will. But we're gonna attempt to tackle 3 of these fruits, and these fruits are the fruits of goodness, faithfulness, and gentleness. And as I mentioned last week, I'm not planning on going through these necessarily in some sort of linear order in how they're written. I'm kind of bouncing around to the different fruits. And so this week, goodness, faithfulness, and gentleness. Now I want to just pause and remind us as we're going through this together that these are the fruits of the Spirit, right? These are not fruits that are characteristically understood as in a full expression in the life of Darren Johnson or Roy Seitz, right? Or Pat Raymond, right? Or any of us here, right? These are not necessarily, they're not our fruits. These are the fruits of God's Spirit, right? This is the fruit of the life of Jesus, the fruit of the life of the Spirit within us. And so it's not meant to be a grocery list for us to look at, as we said last week, of looking at these fruits and saying, you know, man, I struggle with all those things, right? Well, you're in good company because we all do, right? The work of the Spirit is in an ongoing place of transformation in our lives. But it's not about you just trying to make a checkoff list and go down that checkoff list every day and say, well, how patient was I? Okay, I need to try harder at that tomorrow, right? Or how kind was I today? Well, I need to try harder at that tomorrow. It's not meant to be a grocery list of things that you in your own strength are attempting to get better at necessarily, right? It's good to have a desire to want to manifest more of these fruits, but it's not necessarily based on an action of your own will. It is an action of the will of God upon you and upon me. And so therefore, my responsibility is not to necessarily try harder to be loving and patient and exhibit peace and goodness and kindness and faithfulness and all these things in my life, but instead is to come to a place of humility where I continually ask Jesus, by the work of the Spirit, to continue to transform my nature into his nature. That's our work. Jesus, would you do this work of transformation more in me? Would your fruit be more fully realized in my life? Right? So that's the place to live. So when we notice that we're being impatient, when we're not being kind, when we're struggling with self-control, don't kick yourself up and beat yourself up over it. Instead, let it be an indication. Now is the time for me to have a come to Jesus moment. Now is the time for me to come to Jesus and say, Jesus, I'm struggling. Your life is not being manifest to me the way that I know you'd like it to be. Would you do your work of transformation? Would you reveal to me ways in which I may be getting in the way of that transforming work? And would you release me in a place of openness to your Spirit to continue to do your work of transformation in us and through us? So this morning, we're going to look at these 3 fruits. And I just want to define these for a moment for us. This may be pretty simplistic for some of us, but take a look at this first one, the fruit of goodness. I don't know, maybe I didn't put a slide on this one. That one's mine. Oh, I did. Goodness. There you go. There it is. Goodness. So goodness, there's a lot of ways to define goodness. Okay, but I want to define goodness this morning as this, as being morally right. Okay, being morally right in life and in actions towards other people. I want you to remember those 2 words, moral rightness. Doing what is morally right is understood to be doing and exhibiting goodness in our lives. Doing what is right. Now, the next one is faithfulness. And faithfulness is defined as being steadfast in allegiance or commitment towards God and others. Right? A lot of times we talk about this and think about faithfulness in the context of like a marital relationship today. Right? And it certainly is that. But first and foremost, faithfulness is something to be attributed between God and his creation. And then third, gentleness, which is really defined as being a little bit different. Gentle is a weird word for us because we have a lot of images and we think the word gentle. Ooh, oh, this is gentle. There's this sense of like, I don't know, maybe it's just me. I kind of get like that, right? That's gentle. But really gentleness, and that's not really to make fun of that too bad, but my sons are going to You're tripping out back there with my actions there. But gentleness is really this action of being tender or kind in our actions and relationships with others. So when you think of gentleness, I want you to think about, what does it mean to be tender, right? To be compassionate and kind with people around us. That's exhibiting what gentleness is. Now, our world is a place where we're going to see some of this manifest in some ways, in other ways it doesn't show up very well at all. Now, I want to just remind us that it's really important to understand this, because there's a lot of folks out there that would look at this and say, well, our world, really, there is no goodness in our world. There is no faithfulness in our world. There is no kindness. There's none of these fruits exhibited in the world. And I would disagree wholeheartedly with that statement. And here's why. We need to remember that at creation, God created human beings in his image and likeness. And when sin entered the world, it caused a fissure or a dysfunctionality in that image-bearing reality. But what it didn't do is it didn't completely destroy the image-bearing likeness of God in people. It created a barrier, it messed it up, it caused there to be aberrations to it and created a lot of dysfunction in those areas. But it did not completely destroy everything related to the image-bearing likeness of Jesus, or the image-bearing likeness of God created in human beings. We have been created, every human being on the planet has been created, remember this, in the image and the likeness of God. Now, because of sin, we are not going to perfectly reflect that today, right? Because of our flawed situation, because of our sin-tainted identity. Let me give you some examples of how we can still see glimpses of goodness, faithfulness, and gentleness in our world by people who don't know Jesus. Okay, just as case in point. People have the capacity to do good things and to make morally right decisions, even outside of a relationship with God. Consider when people come upon a car accident and somebody gets hurt. There's a desire by most individuals to want to go and do what is morally right, correct? To try to seek help towards that individual, to care for an individual. They have no idea who they are, but there's a sense of moral obligation that is wired into us that this person needs help. Therefore, the good thing to do, the right thing to do, is to do what I can to assist them. That is an image-bearing reality of God's creation on humanity, that we retain that ability. Even though we are tainted with sin and dysfunctional because of sin, we still bear God's image-bearing qualities within us. That's an example of that. Or how about when we look out for children, who aren't our own, right? We see a child that may be in struggling or is lost, right? And so there's a sense of like, it's the right thing to do to care for a child that's lost, right? We don't just let them wander into the street, right? Or whatever it may be. I still remember this story, and I tell it all the time about us losing Trey at Disneyland, right? Of all places. I don't know if I told you guys this story, but Trey's shaking his head back. It was like, this story is always in my dad's sermons illustrations. But we went to Disneyland. It was, this time was back in 2006, because I know it was right around the time we were moving to Arizona for a year. And that's a whole other story for another day. But we went to Disneyland. We were with family, and we were in the park at Disneyland near where the fire, when you first enter Disneyland by the fire truck area, the train area right there in the front. And we were all together. We had like Cheryl's family was there and all of our kids, and we were getting ready for a great day, and we met up there and did our thing. And then we decided that we were going to leave and go across to California Adventure across the way. And so we exited the park. And we walked across the park and went all the way to California Adventure, and we gave our tickets and scanned them and walked in, and we started walking around the park. We got all the way around where the Roaring Rapids are, and I still will not forget Cheryl saying, "Where is Trey?" And I looked around, and we looked at our loved ones, and our kids were all really young at that point. So we just kind of assumed with so many adults that every adult had an eye on a kid, right? No, it doesn't work that way. So very quickly, Cheryl and I realized that Trey, our 2-year-old, I think he was 2 at that time, was not with us. We did not have Trey. And so you can imagine the sheer panic that we experienced in that moment. Oh my goodness, where is he? And how long has he been missing? Right? We looked around, we couldn't find him, and we did a quick backlog. When was the last time we saw Trey? And we remember, when we took a picture, I think, with Mickey Mouse at the fire station in Disneyland. And so at that moment, Cheryl and I just hightailed it out of California Adventure, and we ran full speed out of California Adventure across into Disneyland. I won't explain all the conflict I got into with the Disneyland people that didn't want to let me into the park because I left my park hopper ticket with the rest of the family, but that's another story as well. But I eventually we got through the gates there, and we went and we didn't find Trey, but we went into the guest services place. We were panicked, white faces, and the attendant looked at us and she said, "We have him." And we said, "Oh goodness, okay, great." So what had happened is essentially we had left, taken our pictures, and had left, and Trey just kind of was there and wandered off a little bit, and we were gone, and he just tugged on some lady's shirt, and was looking like, "Do you know where my parents are?" And she proceeded to take care of him and take him to the Disney staff. And wouldn't you know, I don't know if you knew this or not, but actually Disneyland actually employs people. I think this is maybe an inside secret with Disney, but they actually employ staff that actually are on the lookout for lost children. Like that's their job, to care for children, to make sure it's a safe family experience. So they know that if something like this happens, that kids aren't going to be abducted and stuff like that. So anyway, long story short is this person walked us down to this place and around a corner, and we walked into this room, and there was Trey, sitting on the floor watching Disney movies, right? In this really beautiful room, right? And there he was. And so we got our son back, and that continues to be a sermon illustration that I share all the time. The point being that this, full circle. That was a fun story to share, but the point being is that goodness is exhibited in that context as well, right? We see people caring for each other in places of need. There are morally right decisions that we make. Just because you're not a follower of Jesus doesn't mean you don't have the capacity to make morally right choices and decisions. We know this to be the case in all of our interactions today with people. How about faithfulness? People have the capacity to stay true to their spouses, committed to their family in the face of temptation. Just because you're not a follower of Jesus does not necessarily mean that you're just going to throw Willie to the wind and say, "You know what, I'm going to be unfaithful to my spouse," or "I'm going to leave my family when life gets hard," right? So we have this sense of faithfulness that's inbred in us based on God's image-bearing likeness, and this is human beings. That we are drawn towards doing what is right, being faithful to commitment. Albeit that doesn't always fully manifest, right? But more often than not, it does. And that's a result of God's image-bearing likeness in us. Or gentleness, how people have the ability to be tender and kind to each other, even in the midst of difficult situations. There's still the ability for people to do that. And so humanity shares the capacity to exhibit these image-bearing characteristics in some measure, but not perfectly. And here's something I want to clarify, not ultimately the way that God intended, right? The fullness of life that God intended in this way. So consider again the breakdown in these areas. When you think about goodness, it is not abnormal to see people make immoral decisions, instead of choosing what is right, going against what is right to be self-serving. That is certainly characteristic in our own lives personally. Even as followers of Jesus, we have a tendency to do this. And also, obviously, people that we walk and live with in our world today as well. Consider how normative it can be in many ways in our context to slander and destroy other people's reputations in order to climb the ladder of success in companies. It even seems like our whole political system is built on this, right? I always find it comical and sad at the same time how in a political election year, right, like it's totally appropriate for candidates to just completely abuse each other back and forth. And then when the election's over, it's like, okay, we're on to something else, right? So it's like there's just this acceptance in our society that it's okay to be, abusive to each other with our words, to slander, to not treat each other as human beings in many different ways, right? And so there's a brokenness that we experience in our world and our society. We deal with this with faithfulness as well. It is not uncommon to have people experience marital affairs. It is not uncommon for mothers or fathers to leave their families over an affair, or because life has gotten too hard. I need to find my younger self, so I'm going to jump on a plane to Tahiti with some girl I met and start over, right? It's not uncommon to hear those stories, as sad as that is. And we are definitely not people, generally speaking, who tend to exhibit gentleness at a core of how we operate. Think about how natural it is for us when we are treated poorly to respond in a way that is defensive and angry towards the response of how we've been treated, right? And so this idea of gentleness is not very common to our instinct as well. And so the reality, friends, that I'm trying to paint for you is that these fruits, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, like these are things that we can see in humanity. They exist in the places that they do exist. It's because of God's gracious image-bearing likeness upon us. But we are also not fully manifesting and living into these fruits the way Jesus intended. And we can see that evident in our world all around us as well. But when we come into a relationship, a life-giving relationship with Jesus, we want to be people who open our hearts to his work in us. And we begin to see that his desire is to free us from the destructive ways of living and to free us to new life. And to be able to he wants to cultivate the growth of these fruits to full maturity in our lives. But again, most often this starts by reorienting the compass of our lives from away from ourselves and towards God and other people. That's a big change. We have to start thinking about God and others above and beyond thinking about my selfish motivations and decision making. And so if we could just stop being so me-focused as people, we might see more progress to the work of the Spirit within us. That's a message I preach to myself. And it's a daily battle that we struggle with. How can I become less Darren-centric and more others-centric, more Jesus-centric in how I live? When we look at Jesus, we see exactly that, right? Jesus says, I came to do the will of my Father. Came to do what God asked me to do. That was his driving force of his ministry. It was all about what his Father wanted. He modeled for us submission to the Father, which was a model for us of what our lives are to look like in relation to God. Jesus models that we are to submit our lives to God in every way and in every fashion. And that's where we find life. And it attacks, as we've said before, it attacks the CPU of sin's tainted operation within us, which is Darren-centric living, or insert your name, right? Selfish-oriented living, which tends to be the most pervasive God, idolatrous God that we tend to struggle with in our lives. So let's take a look for just a few minutes here with some of the time we have left. Let's just jump into a couple of ways in which we see goodness, faithfulness, and gentleness exhibited in the life of Jesus. Okay? And so we're going to start with goodness. Now look at this passage in Mark chapter. Oh, never mind. Yeah, that's a great picture. That was another illustration I didn't have time for. This is Mark chapter 3. So look at this. This is a place where we see goodness being exhibited. We see moral rightness happening in the life of Jesus. Look at this passage. Another time Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. It's a very interesting story about Jesus embodying the fruit of goodness. choosing the morally right course of action, regardless of the consequences here. It's a great story to illustrate this. He even asks the question of those that are with him, is it better to do good or to do evil? Right? It's obvious what he's getting at. The good thing, the morally correct thing to do is to heal this man, regardless of what day it falls on. And the Pharisees, so Jesus chooses the good. The Pharisees, ironically, choose what is evil because they use that as a way to plot against Jesus to have him killed. Jesus chooses the good, the morally right course of action in the midst of a power structure that would rather maintain power and control over doing what is right. That's what the system was that Jesus lived in. And so those infected with the Spirit of God, those of us as followers of Jesus, are seeing the Spirit working and growing in us to maturity. And as we do that, we will practice goodness in our lives in spite of a world that chooses to do what is wrong and encourages others to do what is wrong. And so we are confronted with needing to exercise goodness daily, to choose the morally correct path in every aspect of our lives. But sometimes it can look differently than we think. Let me explain. When I initially think about making a morally correct choice, known as goodness, being good, exhibiting goodness in my life, this fruit of the Spirit, making a morally correct choice, I immediately think about these sort of things. Moral correctness. Don't steal. Don't lust. Don't lie. Don't abuse drugs or alcohol. Don't be selfish or don't be a brat. Just don't be a hard person to live with, right? After all, a lot of times when we say that a person is a good person, it's often defined by what they don't do, right? A bunch of nots. And this is certainly true. Making morally correct choices does lead us to say no to certain things. But being good and morally right doesn't only exist in the things that we don't do. Being good and morally right and correct is exhibited in active responses, an activity that is geared towards making right choices that are not just geared around what not to do. Let me explain. It's not only about what you don't do, but how we are to live proactively in the world. It is good and it's morally correct. Let's just be clear about this. Foundationally, it is good and morally correct to love always. Let that sink in for a moment, right? That is the true essence of goodness, is loving what Jesus loved at all times and in all circumstances, irregardless of situation. To be good is to sacrifice. To be good is to help. To be good is to be an agent of healing and restoration. To be good is to protect, to listen, to care, to support, and the list goes on and on. You see, I grew up as like a lot of kids do. I think about, doing good and doing the right stuff is all this list of things you don't do. I wish I would have understood at a younger age that my life needs to be less characterized by all the things I'm not supposed to do and all the things I actually am supposed to do, right? Namely, that I am to do everything motivated out of God's great love for me and out of agape love for other people. And then in doing so, then I am able to operate and to live a life that makes morally correct choices because this is what's right. This is what Jesus calls me to do. And sometimes it'll look different than what we would normally assume. And so we want to ask the Holy Spirit to develop goodness in us in a way that can be lived out in our lives. We want to make morally right choices, not just in how we live, but how we respond to other people, right? I want you to make sure that you understand this, that we don't want to look at this from a disconnected point of view. That to be good is, to choose a certain way or to do or to not do a certain activity but to recognize that goodness primarily is going to be oriented around how do we live and operate with people around us. There's a lot of people out there that you could say, well, they're a good person. They stand for moral correctness, however you want to define that, but they're not really good with people, right? Because they shove their moral correctness down your throat. And by nature, they self-indict themselves that they're not fully living and not really living morally correct lives. Because at the very foundation of living a good life, a life of goodness, as described here, is that our motivations and our actions are guided and motivated, again, by God's rich agape love for others and for me. And so we want to ask that the Holy Spirit would develop in us a fruit of goodness in our lives, that we would do what God calls us to do in each situation, that he would help us navigate the times and the places where there's confusion or disagreement about what the right thing is to do, that he would help us to love others foundationally in all times and at all places in our lives. Let me share one more here before we close this morning. I knew I wouldn't get through this, but let me just share faithfulness and look at the life of Jesus in terms of how he exhibited faithfulness. Luke chapter 4. Take a look at this one. Jesus, full of the Spirit, left the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness. And the devil led him up to a high place and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. And he said to him, I will give you all their authority and splendor. It has been given to me, and I can give it to anyone I want to. If you worship me, it will be all yours. And Jesus answered, it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. And so here the passage makes it clear that Jesus was full of the Spirit, a key factor in the ability to exercise the fruit of faithfulness as a lifestyle, right? Again, full of the Spirit. As we're full of the Spirit, we are able to exhibit and to see the fruit of the Spirit come from our lives. And so here what we see is Satan tempting Jesus with power. The only thing Jesus has to do is change his allegiance from the Father to Satan. It's a pretty big change, isn't it? Sure, it's being unfaithful, but look at what Jesus would get in return. As if, how stupid was Satan, really, right? Did he really think this temptation was going to succeed? But Jesus sees through the temptation and the call to be unfaithful, and he verbalizes that God is the only one to be worshipped. To remain faithful to God is more important than having any power, anything else in the world. Is faithfulness to our Creator. And so those of us infected with the Spirit of God are seeing and wanting to see the Spirit of God work and grow in us to maturity. And in doing so, we will see that faithfulness will be developed in us first and foremost towards God in all things, and then secondary in our relationships with those around us. We can learn to be faithful to our spouses and to our family and to our place of employment, whatever it is, right? As we are able to fully experience and express faithfulness to the Creator and to give ourselves to him. And so we want to ask the Holy Spirit to develop faithfulness in us that can be lived out in our lives. We don't want to turn the title of our heart over to anyone or anything else other than God. He is our first love, and we want to remain true to him, keeping him central. This was the thing that the church in Ephesus was guilty of in Revelation 2:4. They had lost their first love. They had been corrupted by selfishness and wealth. And Jesus says, woe to you. Come back to me. I'm standing at the door of your heart knocking. All right? That wasn't an admonition to people who don't know Jesus. That was an admonition to the church. Let me back in the building. Right? Not physically, right? But the building of your heart, your life. Like, hello? Is anybody home? That place that's occupied by me, is what Jesus says. You've lost your first love. You've cast me out. You've filled up, you've hoarded your house with comfort and all kinds of other stuff, other needs. And as a result, I'm sitting out on the front porch in the cold. Let me back in. We want to be people that are faithful to God's work in us, that are faithful to the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. And as we are faithful to him, we gain more strength and ability then because of that to be faithful in all of our external and exterior relationships, spouses, family members, even in our churches, right? We see a lot of this happening in our churches today where church a lot of times has become a place where you just, people are looking to go get their needs met. It's kind of it's a mall of consumer goods. And so we want to go to this church. We want to try this church out for a while. What can they offer me, right? As opposed to saying, where is God leading me and calling me to invest my gifts and my ability in my life into the lives of other people, right? You see the shift there? Like, it's less about seeing our churches and our places as shopping malls and more about places where we recognize that we have been called to be a part of a community where we need to contribute and to receive. There's a mutual relationship going on there. And so we want to be people that are faithful. Jesus models that for us. And we want to be people that model that in our relationships to remain faithful to God. And the good thing here, friends, I just want to say this as we wrap up this point, is that there is hope for us, right? Because let's be honest, right? There are many times that we have not made the morally correct choice. You would say, you know what, that was not a very good action on my part. Or I have not been very faithful in this situation. Maybe I haven't been faithful to my spouse. Maybe I haven't been faithful to my family. Maybe I've thrown somebody under the bus for seeking my own glory, whatever it may be. We make mistakes, right? We sin, we blow it. But there is much grace for us. Jesus paid it all, right? Jesus came to offer us forgiveness and healing. And I'll share this as I wrap up, but my most profound moment of how Jesus interacts with us and works with us in these places of our own brokenness and when we blow it is not standing up in heaven with, kind of like this idea of, kind of pointing down and pointing out all the problems and the faults of people around us and in ourselves. But as I had a very vivid experience, I think I've shared this before, but it's almost like sometimes the Spirit of God will lead us on a little path of discovery. And for me, it's been asking why questions. So I'll try to pay attention to what's going on inside of me. Why did I get so angry about that? And I'll name it. And I'll go, okay, it's probably deeper than that. Why that then? And if you keep asking enough why questions, it comes down, sometimes it'll bring you down to a place where you recognize, you know what? I'm really upset because I've lost control, or I'm scared, or I'm just being too selfish, really. And I still remember instances where the Holy Spirit has led me down that path. And when I'm made aware, when the Spirit opens my eyes to see, you know what, Darren, this is an area where you are falling short. You're missing the mark, right? This is a sin in your life that needs to be addressed. It has never been pounding me over the head with a mallet. It has been an awareness of sin and an immediate wrapping of arms around me, looking me in the face and saying, yeah, it's ugly, but I'm not leaving you, and we're going to work on it together. Let's get after it, right? Isn't that the way we want life to experience? Isn't that how the relationships we want to experience in life, right? Let's just be honest, because we all mess up, right? We make mistakes. We blow it. We want relationships with people around us that will forgive us when we mess up, that will not cut us off, but will exercise grace towards us and love us through our misgivings and our mistakes. And that's how Jesus operates with us. So yes, we are called to exhibit goodness and faithfulness in our lives. And we'll see next week, we'll pick up gentleness. We're called to exhibit these fruits in our lives. And the Holy Spirit is transforming us, and he's doing these works in us. But it doesn't mean that we will always be perfect and we'll never get it wrong, right? And we'll be good all the time. We'll always make the right choices. We'll always be faithful. We won't. We'll make mistakes, but there is much grace. And Jesus looks at us with these piercing eyes. And he just says, Darren, just follow me. Follow me. We'll get through it. I'm walking with you in this life. If I can be for you, who can be against you? Right? And so I just want to encourage us with those words this morning. Let's ask, and I was just going to pray to close this out. Archie's going to come up and lead us in one concluding song. Let me just pray and just ask the Spirit would work in us and move in us in these ways. Jesus, we do acknowledge our need for your fruit to be developed in our lives. And in particular, as we've talked this morning, the fruit of goodness and faithfulness. Would you continue to give us your heart? Give us your eyes to see the way that you do. Would you give us the ability to respond even in situations that don't even seem natural to us? So we go, how in the world did I respond with such patience or goodness to that response? Would we be able to stand back in that moment, make us aware of the work of your Spirit in us, and thank you and praise you for it? We submit ourselves to you, that we are dependent from our hearts. We are dependent upon you, Jesus, to continue to do your transforming work in us. We know that leads us to life in a world that wants to keep us trapped in death. We know that your words bring us life. Your Spirit's transformation brings us hope and healing and the ability to accomplish great things because of your work in us and through us, to free us to walk in freedom, to walk in hope and in peace, and above all, that we might experience and express this rich, irrational, stupid, incomprehensible agape love that just doesn't make sense, but yet you freely just dump it on us over and over and over again. And then you fill us up with it, with the desire to just dump it onto other people. We want that so much. We want to be filled with your agape love, and we want to be able to express it ad nauseum to those around us, that people might see your goodness, your faithfulness in us and through us. And so we confess that we need your work in us to make that happen. In Jesus' name, amen. Go